Columbus didn't bring civilization. The polished school version claims Columbus arrived in a wild, empty land and introduced it to civilization. But the Americas were anything but empty. Millions lived here with complex cities, farming systems, trade routes, and engineering Europe had never seen. Columbus didn't discover untouched ground. He stepped into a world that was already advanced in its own ways. So why the heroic myth? Later, governments needed a clean national origin story, something simple enough to teach kids and patriotic enough to rally a country. Turning Columbus into a symbol made it easier to ignore what actually followed: violence, forced labor, disease, and a takeover that reshaped entire continents. The lie isn't that he sailed across the ocean, it's that he brought civilization to a place that already had its own. The Roman Empire didn't fall overnight. We're taught that Rome collapsed in one dramatic moment. Barbarians charge in. The empire dies on the spot. It's a clean mental picture, but completely wrong. Rome didn't fall like a building. It slowly rotted from the inside. The economy shrank, the army got overstretched, politics turned into a circus, and corruption became a full-time job. By the time invaders showed up, the empire was already a dying patient. And here's the part most people don't know. After the official fall in 476, daily life barely changed. People still spoke Latin, paid taxes, traded, farmed, and lived under systems Rome built. The collapse is mostly a label historians slapped on later to make a long, messy decline easier to explain. The empire didn't suddenly vanish. It slowly mutated into something new, while everyone pretended the old world ended overnight. The Trojan War wasn't pure myth. For generations, people called the Trojan War ancient fan fiction. Heroes with superpowers, gods dropping in like dramatic relatives, and a wooden horse that somehow fooled an entire city. Easy to dismiss as fantasy, but the real lie is the claim that none of it ever happened. Excavations at Hizarlik revealed a fortified city destroyed multiple times, right in the era the story describes. No, Achilles didn't glow in the dark, and nobody gave poetic speeches in perfect meter, but a major conflict between powerful Aegean states, a siege over trade routes, territory, or revenge. That's far more believable than the old academic line of pure myth. The truth is that legends often exaggerate real events, and something big clearly happened there, big enough for the world to retell it for 3,000 years. Salem's witch trials weren't about witches. The common story claims villagers truly believed dark magic was spreading through Massachusetts, but the real cause of the Salem trials was power, fear, and ordinary human grudges. Land disputes, inheritance conflicts, church politics, and decades of unresolved tension exploded at the worst possible moment. Accusing someone of witchcraft became the fastest way to remove rivals, settle personal scores, and silence outsiders. The evidence was meaningless. Fits, rumors, and dreams were treated as courtroom proof. The trials continued because they worked. They solved local conflicts efficiently and brutally. Calling it a witch hunt makes the story sound mystical, but the reality is simpler and darker. This was a political and social collapse disguised as religion. The witches were not real. The consequences were. Sparta wasn't a pure warrior society. The usual story says Spartans were unbeatable warriors raised from birth to fight and nothing else. Cool image, but only half true. Sparta's military machine worked because most of the population wasn't Spartan at all. It was the Helots, an oppressed class forced to farm, build, and keep the economy running. Without them, Spartans wouldn't have had the time or resources to train endlessly. Even the famous Spartan toughness gets exaggerated. Their society was rigid, paranoid, and constantly afraid of revolt. Spartans weren't living in a warrior paradise. They were living on top of a powder keg. The myth survived because it made Sparta look like a clean symbol of discipline and strength. The truth is more complicated. Their power rested on control, fear, and a social system far less heroic than the legends claim. The pyramids weren't built by slaves. For decades, movies painted the pyramids as the product of starving slaves dragging stones under a whip. It's a powerful image, and completely wrong. Archaeologists uncovered workers' villages, food supplies, medical stations, and even payroll records. These weren't prisoners. They were trained laborers working in organized crews, fed well and treated when injured. Building a pyramid was a national project, closer to paid civic duty than punishment. The slave story stuck because it sounded dramatic and fit old Western assumptions about ancient empires. But the real achievement is far more impressive. The pyramids came from skilled teams, careful planning, and a workforce proud enough to leave their names carved inside the stones. The Titanic lie. The Titanic is always sold as this perfect irony, a ship the world called unsinkable going down on its first trip. Great story, just not true. Before the disaster, almost nobody used that word. White Star Line played it safe with phrases like designed for maximum safety or practically unsinkable, which is basically the legal version of saying, probably fine, but don't blame us. But once the ship hit the iceberg, the newspapers needed a headline that punched hard. So they dropped the practically, slapped unsinkable everywhere, and turned a marketing exaggeration into a global myth. It made the tragedy feel like fate instead of what it really was. A mix of cost-cutting, poor prep, and way too few lifeboats. The myth stuck because it sounded cleaner, bigger, and more dramatic than the truth, and nobody argues with a story that good. The Aztecs weren't primitive. For centuries, the Aztecs were portrayed as a backward civilization that needed saving. But the people who wrote that version were the same ones who conquered them. In reality, the Aztec Empire had advanced agriculture, floating gardens, complex taxes, clean streets, running water systems, and a capital larger and more organized than most European cities of the time. The primitive label wasn't about accuracy. It was a political tool. Calling a society uncivilized made conquest look like a noble mission instead of what it really was. A takeover fueled by gold, land, and power. The myth stuck because it simplified history into heroes and savages. But the truth shows a sophisticated empire wiped out not by superiority, but by steel, strategy, and diseases it had no chance against. Medieval people didn't believe in a flat Earth. The popular story says people in the Middle Ages believed ships would fall off the edge of the world. Sounds funny and completely wrong. Educated Europeans knew the Earth was round for centuries, taught it in universities, and calculated its size with impressive accuracy. Sailors understood it too. Their navigation relied on curved horizons and rising masts. So, where did the flat Earth myth come from? Mostly from 19th century writers who wanted to paint the Middle Ages as ignorant and backward to make their own era look smarter. Textbooks repeated it because it was simple, dramatic, and easy to teach to kids. But the truth is straightforward. Medieval people weren't confused about the shape of the planet. That confusion came much later, thanks to authors who preferred a good story over real history. The French Revolution wasn't about bread. The usual classroom version says the French Revolution erupted because bread got too expensive. Sure, food shortages played a role, but reducing a nationwide upheaval to a bakery problem is wildly misleading. France was drowning in debt. The elite paid almost no taxes. Corruption was everywhere, and ordinary people were carrying the entire system on their backs. Bread was the spark, not the fire. The deeper truth is that the revolution was a full-scale collapse of an economic and political order that had been rotting for decades. People weren't angry only because of prices. They were furious at a ruling class living in luxury while the country broke apart. The bread story stuck because it's easy to picture and easy to teach, but it hides the real cause. A society pushed past its breaking point. Napoleon wasn't short. The popular image shows Napoleon as a tiny man overcompensating with conquest. But Napoleon wasn't unusually short at all. He was around 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 7 inches, basically average height for his era. So why the legend? Blame British propaganda. They portrayed him as a miniature dictator to make him look weak, ridiculous, and unfit to rule. Political cartoons shrank him more and more until the joke became fact. Confusion over measurement didn't help either. French inches were longer than British ones, so his recorded height looked smaller when converted. Over time, the propaganda stuck so well that even modern movies keep repeating it. The real man wasn't a pocket-sized tyrant. He was a strategic powerhouse whose enemies found it easier to mock his height than his victories. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. One of the most persistent American myths claims the Civil War was mainly about states' rights or taxes, but the documents from the time make it crystal clear. The right in question was the ability to own enslaved people. Southern leaders said it openly in speeches, secession papers, and newspapers. There was no mystery back then. The war centered on slavery. So, where did the alternative story come from? After the Confederacy lost, many Southern politicians and writers reshaped the narrative to save pride and soften the legacy. They pushed a cleaner version, a noble fight for principles instead of a battle to preserve human bondage. Over time, that revisionist tale spread into textbooks and public memory. The real cause never changed, only the story did. The Crusades weren't purely religious wars. The common story says the Crusades were holy missions launched to free sacred lands, but religion was only the packaging. Behind the banners and speeches were politics, trade routes, land grabs, and struggling European nobles looking for power, wealth, and a fresh start. For many leaders, leaders, the Crusades were less about faith and more about opportunity. Even the timing makes it clear. Europe was overcrowded, economies were strained, and sending restless knights east solved multiple problems at once. Calling it a holy mission made recruitment easier and the violence easier to justify. The myth survived because it paints the era as a clash of pure belief, when in reality it was a messy mix of ambition, greed, diplomacy, and convenience dressed up in religious language. The Black Death wasn't just a medieval problem. Most people picture the Black Death as a distant medieval nightmare, a tragedy that came, went, and stayed locked in the 1300s. But the plague wasn't a one-time event, and it didn't simply end. It resurfaced for centuries, reshaping economies, collapsing governments, and rewriting social structures across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Entire regions changed how they worked, traded, farmed, and governed because populations never fully recovered. The myth of it being a single short catastrophe exists because it's easier to teach and less disturbing. But the truth is that the Black Death lingered, returned in waves, and influenced everything from labor rights to urban planning. It wasn't just a medieval scare. It was a long-term force that shaped the modern world far more than most people realize. Vikings weren't just brutal raiders. The stereotype paints Vikings as mindless berserkers burning every village in sight. Sure, raids happened. They were good at them, but reducing their entire civilization to violence ignores most of who they were. Vikings were traders, shipbuilders, explorers, and settlers who connected parts of Europe, Asia, and even North America long before others dared. Archaeology shows markets, skilled metalwork, political structures, and surprisingly complex legal systems. Many Viking expeditions were about trade, not terror, and countless communities welcomed them as partners, not enemies. The bloodthirsty raider myth survived because it was simple, dramatic, and convenient for the people they fought. The real Vikings were far more than Hollywood's axe-swinging stereotype.